The challenge, the opportunity to connect. The 1960s, a time of imagination and change, a time of anger and fear. The 1960s, a program called Challenge.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Looked at our connections, our divisions, through the lens of faith. Nearly 60 years later, during these challenging times, we'll take a new look at our divisions, our connections, in a new program called Challenge 2.0. We've explored the importance of salmon in our past two episodes of Challenge, certainly as a food source, a defining symbol of the Pacific Northwest, and especially as a critical element of Pacific Northwest Native American culture. Those elements are increasingly the focus of educational and inspirational exhibits such as this one at the Seattle Aquarium, underscoring that not only are many species of salmon threatened, they are rapidly approaching extinction. Will future generations, children such as these, only be able to find salmon in educational displays? We conclude our exploration of the struggle to save them in Part 3 of Spirit of the Waters. This totem pole journey culminated as it began on lands bordering the Salish Sea, here on the University of Washington campus. The evocative carving underscores the interrelationship, the interdependence among salmon, orcas, humans, and water. That problems threatening one threaten all. The visibility of this journey, the increased recognition of the urgency of the issues it raises, including removal of the lower Snake River dams, have been met by an opposing campaign.
Keeping Snake River dams in operation is essential to keep our farms working.
These ads have been sponsored by a consortium of utility, industrial, and farming groups. Although they emphasize small farmers and clean energy, numerous sponsors have denied and actively opposed efforts to address climate change and environmental degradation in the past. Analysts note that key issues are omitted in this campaign, that the lower Snake River dams are rated as one of the 5 most environmentally destructive in the U.S., that needed retrofitting of the dam turbines will require an estimated expenditure of $1 billion, the cost of ongoing river dredging, the presence and growth of alternatives to the hydropower supplied by the lower Snake River dams, the impact of methane emissions from dammed waters. Studies have shown when both are accounted for, the system of dams and barging results in more greenhouse gas emissions than trucking or railroads. The involvement of remotely owned corporate farms and the interest of financial groups in obtaining water rights as speculative investment. Each has led to record sale prices for Columbia Basin farmland. That the 10 million acres of land taken from Columbia Basin tribal nations using conservative estimates of farmland prices represents a loss of $100 billion to the tribes, in addition to the loss of salmon. The violated treaty rights of those nations. This standing room only crowd at the University of Washington was not willing to overlook those issues, nor was the creator and leader of the Lummi House of Tears carvers, Jewel James.
Really happy to be here. I want you guys to know that there's guards posted on the doors, so don't try to get out before I'm done. We'll not let you out.
James is known for his humor as well as his carving artistry. He and his team have provided the hands and the heart behind more than 20 years of totem pole journeys. Many have sought to bring attention and healing and hope to traumatic events, underscoring our common humanity. One commemorated the young victims of the Bellingham Olympic pipeline explosion in 1999. 2 years later, Jewel and his team created poles to commemorate and honor the victims of the 9/11 attack and their families.
When we were finally raising the first pole up in New York, this little boy was speaking. He's 9 years old. And we did that totem pole for the children left behind because so many parents died in the Twin Towers. And that boy says, I'm Italian. My dad's an Italian fireman. He went into the Twin Towers 3 times to save people. The 3rd time, he didn't come back. I'm proud of my dad. And then he cried. You know, and you got to be touched by those moments. It feels so worth it when you do a little art, active art, and it brings people together. That's the whole idea. It brings people together. And our elder from Vancouver Island goes, remember, it's the gathering of the people that makes a sacred moment.
Sacred moments and connection can change individuals and circumstances and produce healing. Jewel reminded those attending the Spirit of the Waters event at the University of Washington they are called not simply to witness, but to act.
I keep that in mind when we're carving. I lost 2 children. I keep them in my mind and in my heart when I'm carving. People say, how do you just carve? I don't. It's a moment for me to remember my children. I lost both of them at the age when they were 19. Several years apart, all right? And so you got to think like it. You got to remember you're here for a purpose.
That sense of purpose, that sense of needed action, has guided these 3 tribal leaders. We spent time in conversation at the nearby Burke Museum shortly before the totem honoring ceremony. So as we do this program, we're very honored to have with us 3 very special guests with great insight into these issues, the challenges, and what has led up to that. I'd like to introduce first, sitting to my immediate left, Jode Gowdy, retired chair from the Yakima Nation. Jode, thank you very much for joining us. Familiar face to those of you that have watched Challenge before is Jay Julius, retired chair of the Lummi Nation. Jay, thank you for joining us. And then finally, Shannon Wheeler, who is the vice chair of the Nez Perce Nation. Shannon, this really focuses on what you're dealing with in your area. So thank you very much for joining us and allowing us to have more perspective on these issues that you're dealing with all the time.
Well, thank you for having me here. Appreciate it.
I wonder if we could start out describing the totem pole journey and how you selected that as essentially a metaphor for the larger issues that we're dealing with, as well as symbolizing these issues. And I know, Jay, your organization has been the sponsor of this. Perhaps you could start, this is not the first such totem pole journey. Tell us a little bit about how that came to be.
Oftentimes we don't have an opportunity to control a narrative that's controlled by industry, controlled by powers that be, whether it's state, federal government, and this really creates an opportunity to share a message, tell a story on the ground, and not battle narratives controlled by others with money, television, and things like that. And it really takes it back to our belief, and that's throwing things up in prayer, bringing people together, community values. And so this here, Totem Pole Journey, represents a lot. As you know well, and as your audience knows well, the southern resident killer whales are at risk of extinction, and they're very close. And whether you look at it from a science perspective or a common sense perspective, a child's perspective, it's a reality that you and I and all of us have to face right now. In our day and age and a time we live, we can witness the southern residents who have been here since the beginning of time, much longer than us, are about to disappear. And why? How is that even possible? And as we look at it from a different worldly lens, like a native person or the lens of an eagle or a lens of a Quetzalmachtin, an orca or a salmon, it's us. And it's our policies and it's our behavior and it's the way we've acted. And for us, I think we each signed, our ancestors signed the treaty in the same year. It's only been 16 and a half short decades, to put it into perspective. One hug away from pre-contact was my great-grandmother, who I grew up with. And it's not a long time ago, so a lot has taken place. And this totem pole journey, the orca pushing her baby, her dead baby, which took place in 2018, for 17 days she showed the entire world. And she was trying to tell everybody something that, we're going extinct and we need help. And the salmon are in the same boat.
So you've all been participating in this totem pole journey over, from what I understand, the last 2.5 weeks. As you've participated in that, as you look at the totem pole that was created by the House of Tears carvers, what does that bring up emotionally, but also what does that bring up in terms of where you are in trying to deal with these issues?
For Nez Perce, what we're seeing and experiencing, and with the help of the totem and those prayers that come along with that, and the ceremony that comes with it, a lot of times with us that helps our message be carried to as well, and other nations' message. But more importantly, it's a message for the environment. It's a message for our obligation that we have the environment. We call Pikawatis Boom Mother Earth, and that relationship for us began since our creation. And we understand that we all have a common thread with one another, and how that's tied. And salmon unites that. They're war salmon people. Jay's nation salmon people. Joday's nation is salmon people. And that common thread tells us a story about ourselves and that voice that we have to be at this time. And things come together for those reasons. And the carving, the totem journey, the ceremonies, the prayers that all came with that came at a time when it is needed. And we understand it as people. And that's why we continue to be the voice for our obligation.
Joday, what's your sense when you look at that, when you think about it?
The theme around not only the salmon, but the spirit of the water, and I think all of our collective peoples, not only Native peoples, but all peoples, if you go back a ways, are going to understand the significance and the importance of water. In our way, we would say Chushiwawakishwit, which is, water is life. And I think that's the essence of all things. So as we are able to kind of see not only the salmon, but that spirit of water, and from Lummi to Eugene, to Astoria, to Portland, to Celilo, to Pendleton, to Mission there, to the Nimipu, to Nez Perce, on up to Shoshone at Fort Hall. It's we've been able to not only observe the beauty of the gathering in the expressions of the peoples of those respective territories and their ways of life, the language that's spoken, the ceremony that comes forth, the manner in which they engage, and the manner in which they express their current right and respectful relationship to that of water and salmon. And so it's a thing that binds us.
I would ask each of you, because I know each of your nations have been leaders in terms of researching the problems in terms of salmon, in terms of the larger environment. Maybe just summarize your sense of where we're at, where we're not at, in terms of the state, the status of salmon in our region.
We view ourselves not separate from the land, but as the same. And that's the unwritten law that we have. If we were to look at our reflection in the water, we wouldn't see our own faces. We would see the trees and the birds and the plants. That's a reflection of who we are. The Industrial Revolution created problems. Sure, they were great for expansion of this country and the way that the country operates today, but there's also these side effects that have affected our way of life and nature's way of life. When they're unable to do that, when the smolt to adult ratio has dropped to numbers that are so low, we have historic numbers that are off the charts. We have healthy, harvestable, abundant numbers that are at another level, and then you have ESA listed species, and then you are the goals, harvest, the goals of returns of fish, and then you have a level of where they're at now. And even this year, there's larger returns, but people are saying there's no problem. Look at the returns; they're 50% higher than last year. Well, that's still poor. That's still poor. That's still barely above quasi-extinction, which is 50 or fewer native fish returning to a spawning area for 4 consecutive years. And when that's happening, they're teetering on the brink of extinction, and we really need to do something now. There's just so many things happening, and we know that that this food system is tied to the orca. We know it's tied to the Salish Sea, to the Salish people, and we know that all the river people are a part of that, and we all have this obligation, and it's just the time to come together, the time for action is now. We look at the things that the administration are listening to and understanding the current situation, whether it's the former administration's environmental impact statements, the biological opinion, and their record of decision that had 20 pages of impacts to tribal nations of a 7,000 plus page document. And that's unfair. That's tribal injustice.
What took place in Europe is happening right now, but the time frames have collapsed at such a rapid pace that this catastrophic disruption is happening way faster than it happened in Europe. Europe used to be a salmon people. And through development of great things in cities, and the rivers went dry and decay took place, and there was attempts by queens and kings and others to save it, but it failed. But it took a lot longer than 165 years for that to take place. There was success in an attempt to make sure that the salmon existed over there. But then it happened. And then a fleet took place. And then there was a landing on the East Coast. And whatever that behavior was, and I'm not going to get in or speak for another country or nationality's behavior and development, but what happened over there happened in the East Coast. And what is the salmon situation on the East Coast? What's the salmon situation in the Sacramento River? And now it's making its way up to us. Columbia, Sacramento was, only second to the Columbia. And it's making its way north, and next, where we're at right now, we are out of time. The marriage in 1855 that was kind of forced between an immigrant sovereign and the true sovereigns of this land, honoring those treaties and the reserved rights and inherent rights of the native people who entered into those treaties with the immigrant sovereign, the United States, there's been a major failure in the word honor and the supreme law of the land under Article 6 of the United States Constitution. So I think we can go through the journals of the individuals and the newcomers who landed here and talked about the tributaries of the Columbia and the Snake and the Nooksack and the Skagit, and all the rivers were so full they could walk over the backs of salmon. It was just rich. They didn't want that in the beginning. They wanted the timber, and they wanted this, and they wanted that, and they wanted land. And then the extermination. Once the mountains were scalped and the trees were, the mountains were annihilated, and then came salmon. And that's kind of where we're at right now. So changing the name to an apple state versus a salmon state, I think, helps us pacify the people. And, this is the salmon state.
230 years and 8 days ago, that original free existence maintained a right and respectful relationship with not only water and not only salmon, but all of our surroundings and environment. And that way of life was sustained in a balance from the beginning of creation to that time, 230 years and 8 days ago. For our collective peoples, 1855 was a very significant year because indeed there was a contract, treaties formed with each of our respective nations, as was expressed. Very simple interpretation, because our people, and it wasn't really a fair thing. All of us have testimonies we could share that are atrocities that happened to our people in those negotiations of those treaties. And I think for our respective peoples, those were peace treaties, because all of our nations were at war. And so those were peace treaties. And so, but what I think is important to note is that each of our ancestors, those were who designated to be able to come to that agreement, to that treaty, reserved rights within the articles of those treaties. Our people brought those advocacies forward, memorialized them, and were promised by the representatives of the United States that they would be upheld forever. And so from our ancestors, our leaders' perspective, that was there, a pathway was reserved. And then you start to see the kind of materialization of different things throughout time that altered or changed the rules or overcame those promises. Because in 1945, when the Harbor Act was passed, that materialized the eventual first dam at the Snake River, that was a violation of the Nimipu, the Nez Perce Treaty. That was a violation. It was also a violation of the Yakima Treaty and the Lummi Treaty, because it impacted those reserved rights within the articles of our treaties. In 2014, there was a drought. It was a significant drought. One of the impacts and consequences of that drought was a massive die-off, sockeye salmon and other species throughout the Enchiwana, the Columbia River, and others. But at that time, I served in the capacity as the chair of Yakima Nation. And when we received the, I guess you can say, the assessment and the reports on what had happened, how things and all this. And so all of our science and fisheries team came in, and they were joined by a team of climate change scientists. And something that was very significant happened at that interaction. They said it was an increase in water temperature pursuant to the consequences of the drought. All right. And I think that many are aware that the Enchiwana, the Columbia River, is already exceeding that threshold on water temperature for survivability of the salmon and other species. Different weeks throughout the summer, sometimes even longer. But in this drought, the water temperature got so high, that was what killed all those salmon. And so then you have the climate change scientists come in and say, science obviously isn't absolute, but when we do our forecasts with regard to what the future holds, 50 years from now, the water temperature that killed off all the salmon will be the normal water temperature of the Columbia River, the Enchiwana. Truth of the matter is that the future of salmon is so dark that we refuse to talk about it and we refuse to acknowledge it.
Who are your nations, and for that matter, who are the people of the Northwest if we don't have salmon, if we don't have orca anymore? What would your guidance be like to anybody that's watching this?
Many times we're experiencing that now, and you can already feel an emptiness when a place that you would normally go to and share your language and share your prayers and songs and laughters and meals, you're told that there's only 8 fish there that you can catch.
I think all of the Northwest tribes and people are kind of in that state of shock right now. I think we all suffer right now from a deep grief. And if not, I'll speak for myself. I mean, it's hard to not be able to, it's hard to think about my son not being able to fish with his son like I fished with my father, whom I lost at a young age, but I did it for 5 years on the water till I was 7. And that may not mean much to people because it's not a sport for us, it's a way of life. And it goes back to the beginning of time. In a Northwest without salmon, in my people, it's exactly that. Our very existence is on the line. We're living in 2022, whether you like to hear this or not, most people don't, that genocide is taking place in your face as we speak, of a people, of a species, and that's the reality. I know it's hard to hear, but that's kind of where I'm at. My spirit and my soul is, so it's fight. But who are we fighting against? We need to fight together, right? We need to come together as human beings. Jeff, if you need blood, and I'm a match, I give you my blood, and you can take it because your body and your blood doesn't know the difference between me being labeled 100% Native American and you being European. We need to come together as humans, as people.
I think, in spite of all the great trials and tribulations that have happened historically and that are still with us today, the beauty of all of us being together and all of us in this together is that it's my personal belief that throughout all the contributions of all walks in life, there's a future by which everybody wins. There is a future by which the original free nations, the native nations of this land, and the practices of our ways of life can be sustained in a manner by which our ancestors had handed down to us, and that we will collectively do our best to hand to our children and those yet unborn to carry as far as we can imagine into the future. There's a way to do that. There's a way to offset the challenges of flood control. There's a way to provide navigation for the agricultural and farming community out there to have their goods go to market. There's a way to create power and generate energy for the Northwest power grid. If only we would tap into everybody who's out there and can contribute to that. If you eliminate salmon from this territory, this northwest area of the world here, I think there's going to be a very, very substantial and detrimental impact to not only our people, but everybody. Because what it is this reflection of a continued disrespectful relationship with water. That's what it is. Because if we were to have a right and respectful relationship with water, and perhaps take every unnatural impediment and our man-made structure or something that's contributing some kind of hazardous or contaminant substance into our waterways, if we could just do our best to remove many of those throughout time and strategically come up with a game plan just to remove those things, all we have to do is get out of the way, because nature will heal itself and the salmon will heal itself if we could just do that. That's as best as I think we could potentially do as far as a right and respectful relationship with water. And indeed, Chushiwa Wakishwit, water is life.
That brings up some powerful questions in terms of who are we? How do we define what makes life worthwhile? What makes a culture? And I think this was an outstanding opportunity for people that maybe haven't heard these views expressed, these concepts expressed, for them to be able to do so. And so I thank each one of you for allowing us to be a part of this conversation. And I would like to turn and thank all of you for joining us on this episode of Challenge 2.0, and hope you'll join us again next week.